Today's speaker is Craig Deforest. He leads the PUNCH Small Explorer mission and the Heliophysics group at the Boulder offices of Southwest Research Institute. He's been studying hot plasmas via remote sensing since 1985, when he worked on analysis software for the charge exchange recombination experiment at the D3D tokamak in San Diego. Since 1995, when he got his PhD at Stanford, he has been working on advancing quantitative analysis of solar and stellar wind image data from many platforms, including STSW and SDO-AIA. And today he'll tell us about how easy it is to analyze images. Take it away.
So me being me, I'd like to lower the lights here just in case people are inclined to not fall asleep. Could we lower? Oh no, this is me, right? Okay. Can you all see that okay? All right. So this is I think this is actually probably the right light level. It's okay. My arm was twisted at Shine after I gave a short version of this lecture. This is something I prepared for the students at MSU and have grown it a little bit since then. It's kind of a litany of things I've done wrong in my career, and in the hope that you won't. And so, given that it summarizes 25 years of stuff, it might go a little fast in places. So, bear with me. We're going to talk about you don't understand your instrument, your eyes are lying to you, you're probably treating your images wrong, you're messing up your display as well. And if we have time, we'll get to the inspirational part and sort of show how all these things can fit together. All right. So you don't understand your instrument. Instruments, I mean, in the lab, we work very hard to make instruments that are very sensitive to the optical effects we seek. But the data themselves actually are much more complicated and subtle than most of us give them credit for in the analysis. So I'm going to talk about a few subtle effects that produce really gross, non-intuitive effects in the images that you might otherwise look at and just think you understand them. So first is resolution effects photometry, and I apologize if you can't see these in the back. I thought this would be a wide format screen, so it's letterboxing it. The top there shows some images from the TRACE spacecraft from about almost 18 years ago now. And this is a iron 9 and 10 image of the corona. We're all very familiar with this. It shows how hazy the corona is with bright features embedded in the haze. But after we accounted for the point spread function of trace, it turns out that in fact the dark parts of the corona are much darker. And so this is a point spread function effect that has effects on everything about the corona, including things like the alphane speed. So inferences that you might draw from the images, because you can see things moving and oscillating and resonating, things like loops resonating at certain frequencies, all of those things that you might infer from this image sequence, many of them turn out to be wrong unless you account for this haze in the instrument itself. AIA has a similar issue. This is an image of the moon, and you can see some diffraction edges here off of the filters in AIA. This is the edge of the moon. This is before and after in two of the different bands. This is the 304 helium and silicon band. This is the 335, a much hotter band. And before and after images of deconvolution show that, yes, in fact, there's quite a bit going on there that we can get rid of. PSF deconvolution sounds horrible and scary if you've never done it. It's actually, there's a lot less there than meets the eye. So typically, if you have an instrument, if light comes in and should hit a particular pixel on the detector, it'll get spread out by the optics. And it'll get spread out in a way that's sort of independent of where you are in the field of view. And so that produces a thing called a point. Well, the MTF turns out to be really hard in real space. You're just multiplying them in Fourier space. So if you take the Fourier transform of your PSF and invert it, which I've done by turning it upside down on this log plot. So here's the core of my PSF spread out here, whoops, here, and the edges here, which is weird. The Fourier transform turns things inside out, right? So the core is here, it's small, so it's big on the Fourier transform. And here, multiplying times a really large number out here, which will make our noise crazy. So we normalize that, regularize it. And if we multiply that times that normalized reciprocal, Fourier transform back, we get something like this. This is an inverse PSF for that instrument. And if we convolve the two, we get a much sharper and taller PSF. So this final plot here shows a very tall, narrow PSF with the wings gone. And so that operation is very straightforward. If you know how to make an inverse PSF, you can just give it to your friends, tell them to convolve it with their data, and the data will get better. Cool. This has important effects. This is one of, can you all see that? Is it too faint? All right. So this is a Hinode image from SOT that Tom Berger made many years ago and published back in 2007. You can see some of his crazy prominent stuff going on here, and you can see all the amazing riot that's going down on the surface, the spicules and various other things that are happening. But you can see them much better if you account for the PSF of the telescope. So this is the same, can you see the difference on the screen there? This is the same movie, but this is normal and, whoops, this is normal. Let's try that again. This is normal. This is after processing for the PSF. That's really phenomenal. You can see many more details in here. I don't have the time to, in just a 1 hour lecture, to talk about every single one of them, but hopefully that's clear to your eye that you can really pick out details both in the spicules and in the prominence that you wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. This kind of effect has non-subtle effects on really important stuff. Granular contrast is an important aspect of convection models, and you get it wrong if you don't account for the point spread function of the telescope. So here's a before and after. I think this, Tom Ayers and I, Tom's in the room. Hi, Tom. There you are. Oh, hey. I think I sent this to you, right, about a decade ago or something? Yeah. Anyway, we were worried at the time that Hinode was getting the wrong number, or maybe the model was wrong. I forget which we were worried about. One of those. Yeah. Here's a more recent result from Joe Plowman, who's also in the room, that if you degrade a magnetic image, just a regular magnetogram sequence of the PSF, you affect the calibration of the magnetograph. And yes. The effective calibration. Right. Sure. Right, so it's not changing the instrument, right? If you had a solid magnetized piece of sun, you'd get the same answer regardless, right? But the PSF interacts with the pattern on the sun to produce a different scatter plot, right? And so if you try to cross-calibrate magnetograms without taking that into account, you will you'll use incorrect factors for your instruments. You'll decide they're not calibrated even if they are. I'm saying that for the web view. Yeah, excellent. All right, so so we now know that resolution, or your PSF anyway, affects sensitivity. Let's go the other way. Sensitivity affects resolution. This is something that should be obvious and that was not obvious in the sense that nobody took it into account for years in the field of coronal imaging. So the idea here is if you have a feature with a certain brightness, a radiance, the larger the feature, the more pixels it has in it. So if there's a certain background noise, the more pixels you average over, the lower the average noise. We all know that. It goes down like the square root of the number of pixels. So the total photometric noise drops linearly in the size of the feature, if the feature is more or less, the same shape. So that's here. Large features have low noise, and as we get smaller, they get brighter. Well, if you're looking at an optically thin medium, now you have a feature that's getting narrower on average as it gets smaller. And so typical features with a certain density contrast will get fainter as they get smaller. Where these two curves cross, that is your spatial resolution. Right? It doesn't matter how good your instrument is. If there's too much noise, you can't resolve any features smaller than that size. Just they fall into the noise floor. Well, here's an example of that. This is a deep field coronagraph sequence from Core 2 on stereo. These were longer exposures than usual, and we saw more detail than usual. But look what happens when we remove the noise through post-processing. All of a sudden, we can see that the corona is extremely structured, even out in the outer part of the field of view. Now, this should not be surprising, right? We saw this happen with trace and again with high C down in the EUV corona. We see it all the time with eclipses. But the outer corona has an obvious length scale of about a solar radius in LASCO images and also in normal synoptic Core 2 movies. But it turns out that length scale is set by the noise level in the images. So taking deep field exposures and post-processing to remove noise shows us that in fact the length scales are much smaller. If we zoom all the way in, we can see that it goes right down to the optical limit of the telescope. So this is a case where we all just sort of ignored sensitivity. We got used to smoothing our images to beat down noise and do better photometry, and we were throwing away all this structure for a long time. Here's a high C movie, or a high C image, excuse me. Over on the right, this is from the Kobayashi et al. Paper. These are spectra, so this is spatial frequency here, in different regions of the image. And you can see there's a nice sort of quasi-power law coming down. It's all very good. And every region of the image, these differ in how bright they are. Each region of the image plows down until it hits a noise floor. There's a knee here caused by noise in the instrument. Just photon counting noise mostly, and that's the effective resolution of the instrument, right? There's the noise break. Here's the effective resolution. Across all MOS, the average resolution is about 0.6 arcseconds. That's a factor of 3 worse than the instrument itself can do. There's a reason why the first really high resolution paper out was about those braided active region loops. It's because they're the brightest thing in the image. So that's the place where you can beat down the noise in that small region and actually get the resolution. There's no reason to think the rest of the corona, as you might infer from the high C movies, is any less detailed than that braided active region loop. It's just that it's all below the noise floor of this particular measurement. So here's an example. I've talked about noise gating to this audience before. This is a post-processed high C image with greatly reduced noise. And over here, you can see some structure, but here, things are kind of a solid mass of brightness. Over here in the noise-reduced section, you can separate that into multiple loops. That's a subtle example. You might not be able to see it in the back row. This is less subtle. This is a sequence from the AI 94 angstrom channel. I stole this from Real et al., who just published it this year, and I was so excited I went and pulled the same data down. So this is the data coming off the instrument. This is after post-processing, and you can see considerably more detail, including fine loop structure where the noise has been removed. So I'm going to run the movie just because it's really cool. So on the left is raw data, on the right is after post-processing to remove noise. Let's do that one more time just because I love this. Ooh. So anyhow, the key takeaway from here is if you only had the image on the left, you would be restricted to lower resolution analyses and you would not see the detail that you see on the right. So the more noise there is, the less you can see, and the things that are affected first are the smallest things. That's your effective resolution. Resolution is weirder than that. There's a really curious enigma here that's been going on for a long time. Why is the corona so tall? You can see these active regions moving around in an AIA movie. It's a recent AIA movie in that I made it just a couple days ago, but it's from 3 years ago when the sun was more active. And you can see that these active regions are typically about 1/3 of a solar radius tall. That's a benchmark that we use throughout the field. The problem is that the scale height, the emission scale height in this plasma, because it's collisionally excited, is half of the actual density scale height, so it's 0.07 solar radii. So you're looking at 3 or 4 scale heights. There ought to be a factor of 100 contrast in brightness between the bottom and the top of the active region, instead of, as we see, a factor of 3 to 10. That's crazy. It's sort of like the dog that didn't bark in the night, right? We see this all the time, so we don't think of it as unusual. There are folks who have looked at how to make these non-hydrostatic loops get supported. I'm about to argue that that could be a resolution effect. If you have a small feature that's not resolved by your telescope, if it gets even smaller, it can't get smaller in the focal plane. It's not resolved. So the only thing it can do is get fainter. All right, so if you have an active region loop that's not resolved, and it has a hydrostatic atmosphere confined within it, the fact that the loop might taper means that you don't know what the real scale height is. The optical scale height, over here, if the strands are all uniform width as they appear to be, you ought to see something like this. We don't see that in active regions, right? The material is suspended higher than that. Well, if you allow the strands to taper below your resolution limit, then all of a sudden the bottoms are much fainter than they would otherwise be, and the apparent scale height is much taller. So you don't need to invoke crazy wave mechanisms to support the plasma, right? You don't need to invoke tremendous supersonic siphon flows to keep the material suspended. All you have to do is assume that your eyes are lying to you, because this stuff is hiding down underneath the resolution limit. That's not to say that's what's really happening. If the field lines happen to get thicker as they go up, as the field gets weaker, you expect flux tubes to get fatter, right? If that happens at or near the resolution limit of your telescope, it will mimic a scale height effect. Right? That's not to say that's what's really happening. We don't know with the current crop of telescopes. It's to say that the telescopes can't tell us about the scale height. Exactly. Exactly. So to repeat for the mic, if the intensity is very high at the bottom, but the feature is smaller than the pixel, then you're seeing the intensity, not the radiance, right? So, yeah. What would cause tapered loops? Well, I mean, we all learned in kindergarten that field lines separate in weak field areas, right? So, so that's sort of the natural state of a highly confined magnetic loop. There's been a tremendous body of literature about how to confine loops and keep them constant width, right? There may be a special class of loop that's filled up with plasma, or they may be twisted in a certain way, and those have varying degrees of plausibility, right? But another explanation is that we're simply not resolving them. I'll come into that in more detail in just a moment. I think you're leading me somewhere, but I'm going there. So this is a good segue into your eyes are lying to you. Resolution effects are weird. You're selectively blind, and motion is deceptive. So give up now. All right. So this, I think, is where Sarah may have been going. Right here in this building, Anna Malinushenko has been doing some tremendous work with the Miram code, with the output from Matthias's runs, showing if you forward model a Miram loop system, you get something that looks very much like an AIA active region. Very much like it. In fact, it's the first thing I saw that really reproduced the flavor of these loops properly. You see constant width loops in there, you see all kinds of things, but if you look at a cross section, this is the crazy thing. The first time I saw this, maybe you've all seen this before, the first time I saw this I just flat out didn't believe it. This cross section on the left is at the same scale as the right. There are no elementary loops in this plasma system, right? It's just crazy. It looks like smoke or something in cross section. But because we're integrating through it, we see line of sight effects having to do with these isthmuses and very complicated shapes in the plasma sheets. And as a result, we perceive loops where there aren't any. Miram is not the sun, but this is an extremely plausible way that the sun could be. And so we cannot make any assumptions about the fact that there are elementary loops based on the fact that we think they're present in AIA, right? Here's a very clear and in some ways more obvious and more natural way that the sun could be producing these image features without actually having this low entropy confined state to the plasma. So anyway, follow up with Anna because her work is really good, and this is in work. It's about to hopefully be submitted. Let's see, leftmost image is showing the cross section, so we're looking obliquely there. On the right, we're looking laterally in the plane. Our eye is in this plane, but off to the side. And in the middle frame, you're just seeing this cut plane. No, middle frame is the cut frame. It's a cutaway of the active region.
It's in that plane on the left.
Yes. So the yellow is sort of an outline of a feature, and these are these are forward modeled from densities in the model. And the key thing here is these vertical stripes are this loop system, right? There is no separate collection of isolated loops.
Isn't that what you expect from this contribution?
I would.
Yeah. So the idea of the loop is, I mean, I've talked for a long time about loops, and people tend to assume they're cylindrical because they thought they were sitting in the thing.
Right.
The degree of symmetry implied by that is just not natural for the sun.
Right. So cylindrical loops are too symmetric. Right. Yeah.
If you look at the flux concentrations in the photosphere, I mean, rarely have I seen anything that looks like a cube that's actually a massive literal swirling magnetic kingdom inside a convecting convecting hemisphere.
Sure, sure. So the takeaway here is that yes, these things are obvious in retrospect. That's what, to my mind, makes this work so brilliant. Is that in retrospect it's obvious, right? But nobody saw it in advance.
Well, obviously, right now, if you walk into the lobby, there's this whole sort of arcade with all these very nice loops that are all lit up.
Yeah.
That run into solar flares and stuff. And there's just this picture in general. As a student learning what is going on in active region. Well, there's these two polarities, and there's field lines, and then there's plasma in those. And that's sort of what's going on in the shaking and stuff. And I saw a couple years ago, Tom Van Rosler, I think, and other people in the Norwegian group are doing sort of similar stuff to this, like saying, wow, there really aren't just loops like that going on.
Right.
Fun to watch that.
It's neat, right? All right, I'm going to move on just because we got more to talk about. So elementary coronal loops may not exist. I showed this at Shine, so some of you have seen this before, but it's totally worth seeing again. This is a picture of a plume that was taken by Trace a long time ago, almost 20 years ago now. This is a polar plume. You can sort of see it's got a narrow base. There's an opening angle of about 30 degrees and this neat sinuous twisted structure. That's kind of cool. Okay, this was taken with EIT. This is the same plume taken with Trace about 15 seconds apart from the other image. And you can see it looks totally different with Trace. The only difference here is the resolution of the instrument. So what you can see here is there is no sinuous structure. There's a bright feature on the surface of the sun, you're probably seeing it in oxygen emission, which is much cooler than the corona. And then this really wide feature that's got about 160-degree opening angle with some bright structures in it, right? So let's compare that. Here are some features you might trace. The solid ones are from the EIT. The dashed ones are from Trace. They're completely different. And the only difference is this factor of 5 difference in resolution. So the takeaway there is within about 6 times the resolution of your telescope, you don't know anything. You're just inferring what you see, and it's highly model dependent because there are no smaller cues for you to take to figure out what the structure is. So if you're working down at the resolution limit, you better know what you're looking at. Otherwise, it's very easy to make assumptions and be wrong. All right, moving on, selective blindness. I love this demo. I've been showing this demo for a long time. This is a movie that we made with Soho MDI back in the 90s. And this is just your typical ordinary piece of quiet sun, right? You've got the magnetic carpet evolving, convection going on and stuff. Around that time in the late 90s, Alan Title used to show movies like this, and he would highlight places where flux was emerging. So we automated that process. So we've tracked every feature in this movie. They all have numbers on them now. And you can see where the bipolar emergence is happening. The code actually was able to identify pairs of magnetic features that appear and separate. And so you can see those highlighted. So what we're not showing in this movie is the anomalous new features. Okay, that's 90% of the magnetic features on the sun appear in a way that seems to violate Maxwell's equations. They appear alone in isolation. That is crazy. That is absolutely insane. If you looked at this movie, people looked at movies like this. Let's go forward. People looked at movies like this for a long time, right? Going back to Karen Harvey's thesis and talked about how new magnetic field appears. We can see the bipoles emerge. If you look closely, you'll see bipolar emergences in here. We don't see the isolated appearances. Once it's called to your attention, you might see them. But until that happens, you don't see it. Joe. There were some large-scale polarities present. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So the main takeaway is just this selective blindness, and we did other things with these data, which I won't get into now. So the thing to take away here is, oh, go ahead. So the algorithm for identifying a new feature requires the feature exist for a little while, and it watches the delta flux in the feature. And it identifies bipoles by looking for balanced bipoles, and if they're balanced within a certain percent, I think we set a factor of 2, then it calls it a new bipole. So yeah, there you go, factor of 2, right? So we know what's going on here. It's resolution effects, that things are hiding underneath the resolution limit of the telescope, right? So, or under the noise floor. Imagine if you were hovering over a football field in a blimp, right? You might not be able to see the individual players, but if they form a huddle, you can see them. So you might say football players aren't conserved, right? Because I can see. We know they're conserved, but they move around on the field in a way that you can't see from that vantage. So anyway, the key thing here is there are classes of feature that you can't see. And so if you're looking at images and you think to yourself, I see everything that's going on in these images, you're lying to yourself, right? If you really want to know, you have to write some kind of code that discriminates in a formal way the features that you want to see or the phenomenon you want to see. Yeah. Nope. It works exactly the same in HMI. The sun is approximately fractal at these scales.
But you would get more than you
you get more bipoles, but you get a proportionally larger number of right, because there's just so much going on underneath the surface. All right, motion is deceptive. So we've all seen this, right? This is a peaceful thing. This is wonderful. We like to watch clouds going by, right? And you can see that wind is blowing from left to right, right? Whoops, I revealed these in the wrong order. The motion is left to right, but the dominant motion in this movie is vertical, right? That most of the material in the atmosphere surrounding the clouds is moving vertically. And you can tell that because the clouds have sort of flattish bottoms. What's happening is water is lighter than air. It's evaporating from the fields and going up. And when it reaches a certain height, it's cool enough that it condenses and forms a cloud. And so, yes, there is a wind that's blowing the clouds left to right, but there's an equally important motion that's about the same speed or greater that's vertical. And you can see it in this movie once it's been highlighted because you can see the small features in the movie. But if you couldn't see the small features, if you had to degrade your resolution, you would only see the bulk clouds, and you would think some of them are standing still and some of them are moving. And you might develop a theory of cloud motion that was to explain that, right? But what's really going on, the dominant physics here, is that material is going up and condensing. So on the context of the sun, if you see something moving in a movie, right, it could be bulk motion. That's the dominant thing people like to see. It could be waves. I've certainly banged my shoe on the podium enough times about that. It could be phasing effects, and here there's no waves going on, right? It's just the relationship between the two kinds of motion and the physics that's happening at the same time that are causing this confusion. So you have to be extremely careful. An example that I didn't show just for time is, but I'll talk about now, is post-flare loops, right, which appear to be expanding, but we now know that in fact they're cooling through the passband of the telescope. So you see these arcades that seem to expand, but what's really happening is they're walking across the field that was reconnected by the flare, and that imposes an order on which ones are hotter, and that produces an apparent motion. Moving on, image resampling. Again, some of you have heard me bang my shoe on the desk about this a few times. I want to call it to everyone's attention. If you want to distort an image, you have to think about what is an image. Well, it's a function mapping xi to the reals, or the rationals if you prefer. So there's an image, and you've got these xi's. If you want to distort your image, you have a new coordinate system, right? And so you have some coordinate transform that relates the old to the new. You learned about this in polar coordinates back in high school geometry. So here's some examples: shifting, rotating, scaling, shearing, all these nice things. Polar transforms, which I like, perspective transforms, map transforms, all kinds of stuff, right? We like to do these things to our images to rectify them and to match them one to the other and all kinds of stuff like that. All right, so the way you do this is you find the inverse transform that takes your output coordinate back to the input coordinate, and then you just apply it. You say my new image at a particular output pixel is just the original image at the inverse transform of that coordinate pixel. Easy as pie, right? The problem is the image is only defined on integers, right? They're pixels. So what do you do when the point doesn't land at the center of a pixel? Well, that's the juice. That's how we resample. And you're probably doing that wrong. So here's the problem in a nutshell, and I know I've shown this on a screen in this building before, but it's worth going back over. Here is a pair of images, lower left, lower right, that are related by a coordinate transformation. It's a high-order polynomial. The specific transformation doesn't matter. What matters is the characteristics of it. Here's our original image. It's a couple of squares with dots in the middle. When we distort it, that's what the original pixels look like in the output plane. And these X's are where the output plane pixels are. This is where they land on the input plane when we inverse transform. You can see over here we're oversampling. That makes this very large bar. And over here we're undersampling, and that makes this crazy mess. All right, so what's happening here is our coordinate transformation can be locally linearly approximated. If the linear approximation has too large of a characteristic, it'll skip over pixels. Pretty straightforward. And then you'll get aliasing. If you ever took solid state physics when you were in grad school, you'd know all about aliasing and Brillouin zones, but that's like another lecture. So what do you do? Well, you filter your data. In the output plane, if the data have spatial frequencies that are too high to be represented, they alias down. So what you do is in the input plane, when you're sampling, you average over regions of the input plane. And what that does is bring the spatial frequencies in this part of the image down to what can be represented by the new pixels. So here's the bad way that you're probably doing, which is linear interpolation. Here's the good way, which is to average over regions in the image. Now, this is great for a quick look at your data, but it's not good for doing any kind of photometry or for looking at small-scale motions or anything like that, because you get moire, you get problems where your noise level varies with phase according to the input grid, right? As you move across the input grid, your noise level changes. It's crazy. So if you're doing real work, you want to take the extra computational time to average over the footprint of each pixel. There are algorithms to do that. I wrote one a long time ago. Other people have written other ones since then. You should do it. So here's sampling versus filtering on an image that we're just zooming. So this is actually a nighttime map of the US, And when the zoom factor reaches 1, watch what happens to the lights. Okay, here it comes. Bam, over on the left they started twinkling, right? That's the aliasing I was talking about. Over on the right, where we're doing the proper resampling, it's steady as a rock. Okay, so now let's go backwards and you'll see again. You got shimmering on the left, and over on the right it's steady as a rock. Now as we come back up through Unity, watch what happens to the edges of things. Over on the filtered side, you'll see smooth expansion, and over on the sampled side, you'll see the actual pixel boundaries moving. Right? So those pixel boundaries aren't real. That's an artifact, and it might help you get your bearings in the original image, but it's representing things that your data can't actually tell you. So you want to be very careful about understanding what you're doing to the data when you resample it. All right, here's another example of linear interpolation. This was what allowed us to do the background subtraction of the star field that lets us image the solar wind, and that enabled punch. By the way, there are punch stickers over there if you'd like some. So in order to remove the star field, you have to fix it in the field of view. On the left, we're using linear interpolation to do that as the star field moves across a detector. On the right, we're using optimal filtering. I don't know if you can see it on the back, but I know on the front you can see this image on the left appears to be breathing. And what's happening is as the stars are moving across the pixel grid, the linear interpolation can't actually move a star a fraction of a pixel. It can only smear it across 2 pixels, right? So when the phases are anti-matched, the stars are spread, and then they start unspreading in the opposite direction. So they do this inchworm across the screen. It turns out that really screws you up if what you're trying to do is subtract a steady background. So being able to do this proper resampling allowed us to remove the stars in a way that couldn't have been done. By the way, right here where the cursor is, that's the planet Uranus. Uranus, whatever, right there. Yeah, it's moving just very slowly, and at the end of the movie it jumps back. All right, so even your plotting software sucks at this. It's really bad. Everyone's plotting software is horrible. And here's an example. This is just a bunch of white lines that I've rendered on a pixel grid and then displayed. And look at these jaggies. Look at how bad that is. It's bad on my screen, not just on that screen. And here, there's a different set of jaggies, right? And here, when we zoom in, you can see, other jaggies. If we treat that photometrically and oversample it and downsample it properly, and then display it, you can see it's much smoother. It looks great on my screen. I did not properly calibrate this screen. I tried. So we have jaggies here, but on my screen, which is calibrated, it's perfectly smooth. This is better. This is better. Neither one of them is perfect. The key here is to realize that just as photometry is messing with resolution and causing artifacts in your data, it also causes artifacts on your screen. So when you display images, the way you display them really affects the level of detail you see, and it affects it in ways that are not obvious, right? These jaggies we're all used to, so we think, well, that's just jaggies. But they can really deceive you, especially if they're interacting with features that aren't perfectly straight in your data. So you want to be careful when you're displaying things to understand what you're doing. Speaking of which, yeah.
So do we just have to use a higher DPI in our plots, or like, what do you do there?
One way is make sure your screen is calibrated and produce plots with photometric resampling, and then display them at high resolution to the best you can. So image display, you're doing that wrong too. Okay, I think people here may have a good understanding of this, but I want to call it out anyway. Your eye doesn't respond linearly to radiance. So as you look at the screen, right, there's radiance on the screen. That's brightness averaged over a spot. And your response goes sort of like the square root of the cube root of the radiance. And people take advantage of that. sRGB is the standard RGB color standard that everyone's monitor uses. And it uses a quasi-gamma curve. That is to say, the signal going into a pixel is raised to the power gamma, 2.2 in this case. It's actually 2.4 with an offset, but over the range of pixel values, 2.2 is a good approximation. What that means is the luminance that's coming off that screen, the radiance of a feature on the screen, goes like it varies a little faster than the square of the data. So if you're taking data from AIA and displaying it straight to the screen, you see something like that. And you think, wow, there's a lot of contrast in the sun. BS. What's going on is there's a lot of contrast in your screen, right? What's the first thing we all do? We take the square root of the data. So here's the direct image, here's the square rooted image. You take the square root, the image is clearer, you can see more. Why is it? Well, this is more true to the actual luminosity of the sun in EUV, right? We took a photometric image, and by square rooting it, we've approximated the gamma coding that your screen is doing. When we actually gamma code it, we can see a little more detail. It's a smaller effect than taking the square root because we're going from 2 to 2.2. But it's still significant. We can see much more detail because of it in the dim parts of the image. So when you're displaying your images, you want to think carefully about what you're trying to highlight. If you're just shooting your photometric data straight into the screen, you're getting too much contrast. You really want to gamma correct your data. Likewise, if you're downsampling an image that you just found in somebody's plot or off the internet, if you resample it, by averaging pixel values, you're going to get the wrong answer. So here's a nice spot with a cross. If we downsample it over here to 16 by 16 just by pixel value, you get one answer. If you sRGB correct it, so you take out that gamma factor and then interpolate and then re-encode it, you get a very different answer. Okay, so if you're not doing this decoding, then working in photometric space and then re-encoding, then you will underrepresent small features in your data, right? So here's a way in which your display will couple with the apparent resolution of the data you're looking at. Everything sucks. But if you're aware, you can do much better. Joe? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. So the question is, does the monitor gamma get applied independently to each channel? Yes. So the history of gamma functions goes back to the CRT. CRTs used to be engineered to have a particular gamma function because it was easier to encode the signal in a television signal, and you got better signal to noise, so the picture looked better if you did it that way. When people transitioned to color, they just kept the same gamma in each of the RGB channels, and that persists to this day. I could spend a whole hour talking about color tables, but I won't. I will point out that there's a perceptual color space. You should really pay attention to your color tables. Different colors are not equivalent. The RG and B channels of your eye are not actually orthogonal to each other, and you can bring out different things and different levels of detail in different channels. There's a demonstration I should have thrown up here that I put on Facebook a while ago that has a bunch of gold balls with stripes of different colors in front of them, and the balls look like they're red, green, and blue, right? You don't perceive color with the same resolution that you perceive intensity. So be aware of all these effects, but I don't have time to go into all of them today. Yeah.
Have you looked at historical archives or dealing with workers in historical archives for public data? Have you looked at this stuff?
I have not looked at photographic data because thank God we don't have film anymore. But film does have its own gamma transfer function, right? Aren't they? Mm-hmm. It'd be very interesting to go back into the archive and try and photometrically calibrate some of the existing stuff. I know I was in Art Walker's group, and we all spent about 3 years working on getting what I now consider an inferior calibration on our film. Film calibration is really tricky work, as you know, but I think there is some value to getting it done if somebody feels like doing that. All right, transform your images to isolate information. So I've been such a downer for the first 3/4 of this talk. I thought I ought to finish with an example of what you can do without very much effort once you sort of understand these things. So I'll talk about your friend, the Fourier transform. So it makes small things big and big things small, converts convolution into multiplication. We talked about that. I'm about to bring up that you can isolate objects by their velocity and size rather than image plane original location. That's cool. And then, of course, you have to handle it with care. You need to apidize your data. So here's a sonic filter, which I think is really a cool thing. This was taught to me by Dick Shine back in the 90s. All that stuff in wave theory in E&M, which many of you took, talks about k-omega diagrams and where on the k-omega diagram a particular kind of wave lives. Well, it turns out image features have their own. If you Fourier transform an image sequence, you get k-omega space, and things that are moving at certain velocities live at certain places in that space, and you can isolate them. That's really neat. So here, by keeping things inside this cone here, we can isolate noise that we couldn't get rid of any other way. So these are late stage movies in a demonstration sequence for background subtraction of the High 2 movies from stereo. So on the left, we've taken the background subtraction about as far as we can with per pixel analysis, treating each pixel as a time series. Using this Fourier technique allows us to discard all the artifacts which aren't moving and keep all the things that are moving, which is the solar wind. So this is just sort of a neat example of the frankly visually astonishing effects you can get by dropping into this space and coming back out. So here I'll run you through a sequence of steps that we've done to Core 2 images to extract information about where the sun's Alphane surface is, the what used to be called the Alphane point. So here's a series of Core 2 coronagraph images. We want to understand things that are moving in versus out, and so the natural thing is to go into a coordinate system where the coronal expansion is just motion. So in polar coordinates, the general radial expansion of everything is just motion. That's very helpful. So having done that, we can normalize each row to get rid of the overall shift in brightness. As we get farther away from the sun, the density goes down and the sunlight goes down, so the corona gets fainter. We can take that out. Well, if we Fourier transform it, so here's radius, which is vertical in that last movie, and here's time, which was time in that last movie. If we Fourier transform it, we get wave number and frequency. If we keep these two quadrants, we have things that are moving out. And if we keep these two quadrants, we have things that are moving in. I think on this slide I may have got that backwards. I've had this for 10 years. I should have fixed that by now. And the point is that some of them are going in and some of them are going out. So if we do that, we get this. That's neat. Now look over here. You can see stars on the side of the sun that are moving in, and there aren't any here. And over here you can see stars moving out. That's sort of neat, right? We can isolate the part of the thing that's moving in from the part of the thing that's moving out. In the streamers, we see lots of outbound features. There's a little mini CME. We see stars. The streamers are stationary, so they're in both because they're equally in and out. And you can see the sort of rain that's coming in here. That's the inbound half of the uncorrelated noise. Right? There's noise everywhere, and it's moving all directions at once. Yeah, Joe. Noise flowing up, exactly. Yeah, one of those. Okay, so if we go back into focal plane coordinates, that's what you see. left is the familiar corona, the right side is the inbound corona. Proportionally, there's a lot more noise, but you can already see some features. For example, when the CME moves out there, you can see inbound features moving in on the right. That is the corona rearranging itself, right? We know the corona rearranges to find a new equilibrium when something moves through it. It communicates by waves. That is the motion. That is the corona sending waves back in to reorient itself. That's really cool. Some of that is retraction, right? Some of it's waves, some of it's actual things retracting. I already talked about that. Can't allow ourselves to get confused on that front. But still, the inbound corona is something different. All right, so now if we take, instead of a movie, we look at a slice. So time is running left to right, radius is running vertically. I've inverted the two, so the outbound is on the bottom, the inbound is on the top. You can see that there are inbound stripes here. At first glance, this looks like noise, but it's not. These stripes are far too long and coherent to be noise. And so we can actually analyze the characteristic of the stripes. We can say how much variation is there in the image as a function of how fast things were moving inbound. If we do that at different locations, we get this, right? This is a preferred band of speeds. On the right, we have speed. Whoops, whoa, not quite ready for that. This is distance from the sun, radial distance in the coronal hole. This is speed now, not time or anything like that. And this is a normalized variation. It's normalized at each altitude in the amount of variation, Fourier energy, if you will, in features that are inbound at that speed. And you can see there's this ridge of preferred speeds. Up here, we got noise limited. If you look with the eyes of belief, you might see this turn over, but you might just look with the skeptical eyes of somebody who looks at noisy images and say, there's nothing there, which is what we did. So in the original paper, we said, well, there's a preferred range of speeds. What could be preferring a particular speed? It must be inbound waves. We're done. The Alfvén surface is outside of 12 solar radii. Well, since then, we've done this other analysis where we found it. There's all this density variation. There probably isn't an Alfvén surface per se. It's probably a zone where, I'm not going to get into that. It's probably a zone. But in a classic example of Deforest analyzing his images the wrong way and not taking his own advice, we assumed these were waves. And it was only a year later that Tenerani pointed out, no, in fact, this curves the wrong way. What you're looking at is an ensemble of inbound jets. There's reconnection in the outer corona. Return jets are coming in and hitting material and slowing down. And they're preferred just because that's where the reconnection is happening. And that's a much more plausible explanation. We had a hard time explaining why the inbound wave speed would be increasing with height. So anyway, what's neat here is by transforming these data several times and understanding those transforms, we're able to back out a signal in a quantitative way that's present in the data but not apparent to the naked eye. That's cool, right? So if you actually take the time to think through what your image can do for you and what pitfalls there are, you can actually take this kind of analysis much farther than you might think if you've just looked at a lot of movies. So now it's time to sum up. Think of your images as entities in a kind of data space. Distort them to where you want them to be so that they will highlight the information you're looking for. Don't shoot from the hip, right? You're blind, you misinterpret things look like what they're not, and it's very counterintuitive how resolution and other effects can affect even very large-scale features in the data. You're doing a lot of things wrong now, right? These images are counterintuitive and subtle. Even people who've been doing this for years and are suitably skeptical can easily jump to a wrong conclusion, as I did in 2014, about whether these things were waves or jets. And do transform your images to help your analysis. Don't be afraid to distort, shift the brightness to something either that's representative or even non-representative, provided it pulls out the feature you want to see and you understand what you're doing to the data. That's all I got. Thank you. Sir? trust nothing. Right? Or trust but verify. So if you think you see an effect in the data, make absolutely certain that it's not in the instrument first. We're all good at that. But then try and think about, how could the sun be fooling me around these limits of the instrument? Sir?
Do you think that these costs, for example, the noise gauge, automatically apply to data pipelines, or would that be more incremental data? More harm than good.
I vacillate on that. I think it is important to give people access to the raw data, because somebody will go back and look at it and find something you didn't see or that you threw out in the processing. On the other hand, it's a lot more convenient to work with data that have been processed in sort of a best practices way. So I think you have to do both. I mean, noise gating to make things more obvious is great, but it works by throwing away 90% of the information in the data. Right? So if there's anything there, you've just lost it. So you want to make sure that if you do, for example, noise gating, you also want to retain the original data. Does that help? That's right. The trick is to remove what you don't want and keep what you do, but you don't know in advance what you want. Sometimes you do.
Okay, my child. It's a real ad on TV.
Okay.
Fine, you know, the processing photo of the camera. Where the other child who happened to be somebody else's actual child.
Right. Sure.
So it strikes me that the people that are buying cell phone cameras, high-end cameras, cinema cameras, like the whole world out there, photographic and partially
So it's very interesting, actually. I've done a lot of looking around in the recent literature because of this very effect that cell phone cameras and other consumer cameras are getting really good because we're, as a race, getting good at image processing. It turns out I mean, yes, there's a lot to be found there, and I encourage anyone to go to SIGGRAPH or one of the or SPIE, right? That has whole sections on post processing. However, most of the off-the-shelf algorithms aren't photometric, right? So that doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, but it means you have to use them with great care, right? These are algorithms that were created and tuned to look better to the human eye, right? And our goal is not necessarily to have good-looking images. Right? We want to pull out certain types of feature. Yeah. Right. So that is to say, yes, I think adopting this wealth of algorithmic knowledge that's exploding in the market is great. On the other hand, like everything else, we have to use it with caution.
Just for instance, I go back a couple of decades, and
Yes. Right.
tools are not, tools that I'm knowledgeable about, are not as sophisticated as that.
So if you're looking for a recommendation for software, I've been using Perl for 20 years. I'm about to migrate to Python just because the writing's been on the wall for a decade. There's a lot more momentum there. I think in Python and SciPy and SunPy, you have access to a lot of work. I mean, Python's become the lingua franca of the computing community. And so there are a lot of image processing packages that might surprise you that you can just download and use. And the fact that many of us don't is a testament to the fact that we've all grown up with a certain set of tools and continue to use them. I'm sorry, but here and then these Gilly and Tom.
Going back to one of the first things the university did, looked great, so why don't we do that all the time?
I don't know.
Is it configured okay?
Well, go ahead, Joe. Sure, right. I mean, the reason I regularized there is when you divide by a small number, you're multiplying times a large number. Noise is about equally distributed in a Fourier plane or Fourier space. So when you amplify part of Fourier space, you're amplifying the noise that goes with it. So there's a trade. Right, but on the other hand, the kinds of stuff that I've been doing with these broad wings in the PSF don't affect your noise level that much because they really have to do with a small part of Fourier space, right, that corresponds to the big wings of the. So beats me, we should all be doing that. Right. That's correct. Doesn't matter. Yeah. Gilly.
I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring this to the curriculum that even at CU specifically, but just in general, there's a lot of instrumentation about classes. I've taken several of them, and there's just tons of stuff here I've not even heard about, let alone been taught about how to deal with it. So I'm not sure if you've been thinking about that at all, but so there are classes taught right now over there about stuff like this. In the ATS major, there's an instrumentation or and statistics class that every major takes, and it's they're like, this is what a focal that's like the level right there.
Sure.
So I think that there's a lot of opportunities.
So an advanced lecture series maybe would help.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
They do a seminar, weekly seminar hours on
Maybe we should think about that. Make a pitch to Mark or somebody.
Sure.
Thanks. Good comment. Tom.
So, you've been talking mainly about spatial time series. Now, there's a whole class of images economies that are, say, stigmatic stuff, where you're mixing on the same image spatial and spectral information. So, what should we be doing, or what are we doing wrong with those kinds of images? What are the showstoppers, the pitfalls, and kind of analogous to what you described for spatial?
Sure. So the question is, what are we doing wrong with spectra?
Yeah.
And I don't know everything you're doing wrong with spectra, Tom. The answer is almost everything you saw here is applicable to spectral images, right? And more things besides, right? Because you have two different PSFs, right? One for the telescope part and one for the dispersive part, right? And lots of anisotropies in the instrument. As you know, I mean, you've spent a lifetime looking at these things. There are a lot of pitfalls, and it would be useful to build up a lecture series on that, or maybe a seminar similar to this with those kinds of lessons in it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Iris. It's spectacular. I mean, I'm more used to bubble spectra, where the spatial dimension is not much of a source.
So you just get a collection of spectra. Yeah.
There's really all the spectrum.
It's good. We're way over time, so I won't hold people, but I'll stick around if anyone wants to talk after. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Steve is the education czar for the Space Weather Trek program. Sort of talking to him like, we don't do anything for K-12. We don't actually do anything for undergrads. What are some of the actual experience? Jim Green is